And then most recently, my second book was about how to break bad habits. So Hooked was about how to build good habits. Indistractable, my second book, is about how to control your attention and choose your life. It's all about how to break those bad habits. And I am not one of these chicken little tech critics. Everybody tells you the same story. Technology's melting your brain. Technology's addicting you. Technology is hijacking your mind. Bullshit.
My name is Kevin David, and if you want real financial freedom for yourselves and for your loved ones today, then the time is now. And I will be there to help you every step of the way. What is up, guys, and welcome back to another exciting episode of your favorite podcast, or soon-to-be favorite podcast, The Kevin David Experience. Today we have a very special guest, and I know I always say that because it's always true. So big shout out to everybody who left us reviews on iTunes, and you guys who are watching it on the new YouTube channel that we just launched as well. So we have an incredible author, somebody that I've actually read myself, which is always fun to interview, Nir, who is joining us. He's the author of a bunch of really successful books. One that I actually had a really profound impact on my own life as well. So Nir, welcome to the podcast, my man.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here.
Yeah, so how did you originally kind of come up with the idea of Hooked, right? Because, in modern day society, I think social media is so, relevant and just encompasses everyone's lives. And it's a really interesting thing, right? Because these companies have the incentive to make their products as addictive as possible. And then, human beings kind of reap the rewards or kind of negative aspects of that same kind of ideology.
Well, I would say they also reap the benefits, too. So Hooked was about how to build habit-forming products. That book was published back in 2014, and that was about how can we use the psychology behind products like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, Slack, Snapchat to get people hooked to good behavior. So my idea was to democratize the secret psychology behind what makes those products so sticky so that we can use it for good, right? Why can't we get people hooked to exercise and hooked to online education and hooked to fiscal responsibility? Well, we sure can. And so that was the subject of a class that I taught at Stanford, at the Graduate School of Business for many years, and then later at the Hasselplattner Institute of Design at Stanford. And then most recently, my second book was about how to break bad habits. So Hooked was about how to build good habits. Indistractable, my second book, is about how to control your attention and choose your life. It's all about how to break those bad habits. And I am not one of these chicken little tech critics. Everybody tells you the same story. Technology's melting your brain. Technology's addicting you. Technology is hijacking your mind. Bullshit. It's foolish. It is self-defeating, unscientific nonsense. It's perpetuated by people who want to be the saviors, who want to tell you there's nothing you can do about it. You know why? Because they know when they tell you that message, you're not going to do anything about it. And so they become the saviors. And I'm telling you, no, you can do something about it if you want to. And frankly, there's nothing wrong with using social media. There's nothing wrong with YouTube. I mean, look, people reach your amazing, great content that you're publishing for free, right? Like, you take your time to connect with people, to, give knowledge to the world, to enhance people's lives. And you're doing that as a free service for folks. Of course, you make a living from it too. But these platforms are wonderful if you use them correctly. And so we need to stop blaming and shaming and take responsibility and get the best out of these tools without letting them get the best of us.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Social media completely changed my life, right? It took me from, a situation that I didn't like, a situation that I wasn't happy with as an accountant, 9 to 5, to be able to do everything that I had always hoped and dreamed of. So social media is incredible. What would you say to somebody who says that, today's generation kind of grows up in a totally different world? And to play devil's advocate here, my mom and my dad have even said, back in our day, we went outside and played with people, in person, and we had much more face to face. And in today's, day and age, there's much less of that, arguably, and people grow up in a different environment. Do you think that has an overall net positive effect?
So there's no doubt that things are changing. One thing that is constant is change, ironically enough. So no doubt the world is different. Is it better? Is it worse? Yes. The answer is yes. Sophocles said 2,500 years ago, nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. Nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. Paul Virilio, the philosopher, said that when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. Right? Every great technological advancement has goods and bads.
I love
Duh. Right? Like when you invent the ship, you get shipwrecks. When you invent the car, you get car crashes, right? So of course there's going to be bad aspects to a technology that is as revolutionary as the internet. So the idea here is we don't throw up our hands and say, oh, the kids these days, because by the way, people have always said that, right? To give your parents due credit, when they were growing up, people said, oh, that rock and roll music, that's killing kids' brains. And before that, the radio and the television and the comic books. Like literally, you can take verbatim what people used to say about comic books in front of the United States Senate. It is, change the person who says that stuff. It's the same stuff people are saying today in front of Congress about social media. The exact same stuff, like word for word, hijacking kids' brains. Exactly the same stuff.
Video games.
And of course there are potentially negative consequences, but it's much more nuanced. So what we need to stop doing is stop trying to put the world into these black and white boxes. No, the world is gray. There's nuance. It's about who is using it, what they are doing with it, how much they are doing with it, how much they are using it, and what they would be doing instead of using it. Let me give you a great example. Can you imagine if instead of COVID-19, it was COVID-90? Let's imagine that this whole pandemic had happened in the year 1990 as opposed to the year 2019. Can you frickin' imagine how much worse it would have been if we couldn't work from home, connect with loved ones, watch Netflix streaming in our homes as opposed to having to go for entertainment or go outside to do anything with anyone? It would be so much worse. And here we are using these magical devices, talking to each other. I'm in Singapore. I don't even know where you are. We're talking over the span of thousands of miles for free right now. Like this is science fiction. So we can't just put everything in neat little boxes and think that like we've explained the world. No, there's nuance here. And so that's really what I want to help people do, is to understand that, look, this technology can be used for good. In fact, I would argue if you want to get ahead in this world, you have to know how to use this technology to your advantage, because you will be left behind. The difference is that the world is bifurcating into two kinds of people. People who let their time and attention be manipulated by others, and people who say, no, I will decide how I spend my time and attention because I am indistractable.
Yeah. And I love that, because like for me, even right before we started the podcast, I told you that, rising kind of to the top or somewhat on social media, I was literally like using my phone and my computer for like 16, 17, 18 hours a day, and like not going to the gym. And it was like, it had become unhealthy for me. And I was on like the very edge of that like extremism. And I kind of had to take a step back and realize, okay, I've taken it to a point where that's not healthy. Right. And so, having that understanding, it allowed me to kind of, really break down what was making me happy in my life and what was making me unhappy very specifically. And by doing that, right, I can actually, use these incredible tools in a healthy way that actually, led to more happiness in my own life, which I think is important for anyone to kind of break those things down, in more of a microscopic way. So let's talk about the actual, how you do this for your own product, right? Because I have a lot of, entrepreneurs and people who listen to my podcast who maybe have their own product or their own software. They want to learn these psychological elements. So can you kind of break down what makes a product sticky, and then if it can also be applied to physical products and digital products alike, for somebody who might not know, how do you get people to really kind of stick and fall in love with your product?
Yeah, so there's basically 4 steps to getting people hooked on a product. And my book tends to focus on digital products, things that are connected somehow to the internet. And today, look, what business isn't connected to the internet, right? I don't care if you're a restaurant or a dry cleaner, you have to have some kind of online component, or your competition is going to eat your lunch. So basically, it's these 4 basic steps where we have what's called a trigger, an action, a reward, and finally an investment. And so this follows a habit loop with some notable exceptions, starting with the internal trigger. That many people think only about the external triggers, the pings, the dings, the rings, but it turns out that much more important than the things in our outside environment are what's going on inside our own heads. So a habit is formed when the user triggers themselves, right? If you think about when you check Instagram, you're not only checking it because of some kind of ping or ding, you're checking it because of a feeling. Those are these internal triggers. When you're bored, you check Reddit or stock prices or news or the news. If you're lonely, you check Facebook. If you're uncertain, you Google. We are triggered by emotions. So that is critical to know, to ask yourself, what uncomfortable emotional state am I going to connect my product's use to? That's the first step. The next step is the action phase, which is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. And there's all kinds of ways you can make that behavior easier, because we know the easier something is to do, the more likely people are to do it. And then the next step is the variable reward phase. And this is where we look at the psychology of what's called intermittent reinforcement. That if you think about what makes a product engaging, what you will find is that there's always some element of mystery. And this comes from the work of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. He did these experiments where in the 1950s and 60s, he had pigeons and he put them in a little box that today we call a Skinner box. And he allowed these pigeons to peck at a disc. And every time the pigeon pecked at the disc, he would give them a little reward, a little food pellet. And at first, as long as these pigeons were hungry, they would peck at the disc and get a little treat, right? That no big deal. We do this with our, when we train our puppies or our kids at home. This is all about stimulus and response. But one day, he had a problem. He didn't have enough of these little food pellets. He was going to run out, and so he couldn't afford to give them to the pigeons every time. He could only afford to give it to the pigeon once in a while. And what he observed was, to his amazement, is that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeon pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. So we see this in all sorts of things that we find most engaging. When you think about sports, right? If you take a step back, if an alien came to Earth and watched, how we obsess about a stupid little ball bouncing around a court or a net, how much attention this gathers. Why? Why do we love watching sports? Well, because there's variability. We don't know what's going to happen next. What makes a movie fun to watch? We don't know the ending, right? How are things going to resolve? What makes a book fun to read? Why do we like gambling? Why do we like scrolling and scrolling and scrolling on social media? It's all about the unknown. It's all about variability. So that's the variable reward. And finally, the investment phase is where the user puts something into the product to make it better with use. And this is a really big deal, because for the first time in manufacturing history, we are co-creating these products with the platforms. So if you, Kevin, logged into my Pinterest account or my Facebook account, it wouldn't be that interesting to you because the product has been tailored to my interests. And the more I use the product, the better it becomes. So it appreciates rather than depreciates. That is a revolution. So almost any product and service that is used with sufficient frequency can form a habit by making sure they have these 4 steps of the hook model.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that's, there's so many psychological elements that kind of go into, what gets people interested. For me, like something that I've struggled with, right? Because I've read your book. It's an incredible book. Everyone should go read it. And his the new one, which we'll talk about in a bit. But for me, it's kind of these things that in Hooked apply so perfectly to like social media and like free tools. But sometimes like if you have like a SaaS company or maybe you have a product that actually costs money, it's a little bit harder, at least for me, and maybe I'm just kind of thinking about it in the wrong way. Do these same principles apply to a variety of products, or are these mostly kind of attuned specifically to like social media and free products?
So the line of demarcation is not free or paid or enterprise or consumer. The line of demarcation is frequent or infrequent. So if you have the kind of product that is not frequently used, you do not need to form a habit. But you do need to have some kind of other competitive advantage, right? So Warren Buffett calls this a moat. So what could that be? It could be intellectual property. It could be economies of scale. You have to have some kind of competitive moat. Now, the problem with products that don't form a habit and don't have any kind of competitive moat is that you kill your competitors based on price and features, and they kill you doing the same. You just fight with each other to the death on price and features, and you make less and less and less money. But when you have a competitive moat, like a habit, now you have a competitive advantage. Like think about Google, right? The beauty of a habit is that the customer doesn't even consider the competition, right? How often do you think to yourself, I wonder who makes the best search engine. Let me give Bing a try. No, you just Google it with little or no conscious thought. And Google owns 90% of the search engine, not because they have a monopoly in the marketplace. No, it's about monopoly of the mind. It's that we turn to these products with little or no conscious thought, purely out of habit. So habits can be a huge competitive advantage, but that only works if the product is used with sufficient frequency. So if your product is bought and used once, like let's say you sell insurance, okay? You don't use car insurance every day. You only use it, God forbid, if you get in an accident. So you don't need to form a habit. It's a sales-driven a company rather than a product-driven company. So if you have the kind of product, like for SaaS is a great example. If people don't use your SaaS software, you don't get paid. They're going to churn, right? Yeah. So you have to make sure they use the product or they're going to stop using it. You have to form a habit. So that would be a great candidate. I've worked with many companies in the SaaS space, health tech, ed tech, fintech. All of these products have to change consumer behavior to change these frequently occurring habits, or they go out of business.
Right. Yeah. And another interesting thing is kind of the dichotomy, so to speak, of like, simplicity versus like gamification, right? Which is another thing that, I've talked to some of my students about. Like, what's your opinion on gamification and like how simple do things need to be to form habits, right? Because like you can try all these complex things to like force a habit and like gamify, every aspect of your product, but there has to be some balance, right, between, simplicity and between actually kind of gamifying things and actually getting people to form a habit. So where do you think that line is, and which do you lean toward?
So I'm not anti-gamification, but it is by far misapplied. And what do I mean by that? We have to consider what the internal trigger is. So gamification is wonderful when the internal trigger is boredom. Right, so just to give everybody up to speed here, gamification is when we use gaming mechanics in non-gaming environments. So points, badges, leaderboards, things like that. And it's wonderful when the internal trigger is boredom. And so gamification is the reward, and therefore it entertains. But where I see it misapplied is where the internal trigger is not boredom. What if the internal trigger is workplace anxiety? I don't want your stupid badges. I don't care about your stupid leaderboard. Go to hell. Like, I need to do my work. Right? Get out of my way. I'm stressed and anxious about filling my deadline. This crap is bothersome. It's not helpful. So it's really about understanding your consumer's internal trigger. And if the internal trigger is boredom, hey, gamify away, right? Entertain them with these gamified tools. But if the internal trigger is seeking connection, loneliness, workplace anxiety, gamification is probably not the right answer.
Right. And it's interesting too, because like, I read a lot of books, about this topic, and, an example that we recently applied to one of my software companies was something that LinkedIn at least popularized to me, which was kind of like, as you create your account, they give like a little like progress bar that says like, you're a beginner because you've only filled out these three things, because to LinkedIn, it's valuable to them if you fill out more information, because that means that, people can better target you, ads and all of those sorts of things. What are some other examples that you've come across, if you have, similar to kind of like the progress bar, which, to me is very strange, but human nature, right, just wants to finish these like little progress bars. And because like something's very simple you can apply, to your product or your service that really makes people, do more micro commitments, have more kind of skin in the game, so to speak, and be more likely to actually use a tool or software.
Right. So this is called the endowed progress effect, and I give this exact example in my book, Hooked, around how LinkedIn uses it. When you put in that first bit of information, the progress bar goes from 0 to 60%, right? But then with each subsequent bit of information, it goes up maybe like another 20%, and then 10%, and then 5%, and then 2%. Like you never reach the end. This is called the endowed progress effect. That the more we put into something, the harder it is to stop. Right. That we endow things with progress just because we have put investment into them. We invested our time and effort. There's also what's called the IKEA effect, which is when we build something, we give it more value, oftentimes undue value, right? Like IKEA furniture is pretty crappy furniture, but because you made it yourself, look what I did, look what I built, look at this masterpiece. And it's hard, we take it from our dorm room to our first house, and even though we should probably, throw it away. So anytime you can get people to invest in the product, this is what I call the investment phase of the hook. It comes after the variable reward, which is where the user puts something into the product to make it better with use. And I can't emphasize how revolutionary this is. If you think about things in the physical world, right? Your furniture, your car, your clothing, all these things made of atoms rather than bits, they depreciate with wear and tear, right? They lose value the more we interact with them. Right. But that's not what habit forming products do. habit forming products, the more we invest in them, the better they become. They appreciate with use. That's a really, really big deal. This is what I call stored value. And probably the most overlooked opportunity is using data, right? Using data to improve the product with use. I mean, this is why, the Facebook algorithm or the TikTok algorithm or the YouTube algorithm is so powerful, because the more you use it, the better it becomes. And there's a very, human offline example to this. I mean, imagine, let's say you go out to lunch with a friend, right? You go out to lunch and you have a nice conversation, you start getting a little vulnerable, and you tell them about what's going on with your love life and your work life and, what's happening, the struggles you're going through. And then, you say goodbye, and then you see them again in a month or so for another lunch, and you realize they don't remember a single thing you told them. Well, are you going to be their friend for very long? Either your friend has a medical case of amnesia, or they're a bad friend, right? You're not going to be friends with them. And that sounds crazy in real life. Like, of course our friends are going to remember what we told them, but we do this in business to our customers all the time. We don't bother to remember a single thing about them. Now, there's a way to do this in a creepy fashion, right? This is called data gossip, right? That same example. If we had lunch together and then I told some third party about what we talked about, well, that would be gossip. That'd be terrible. But It turns out consumers don't mind at all if you take their data and make the product experience with your product better. What they hate is when you give that data to someone else. Don't do that. That's unethical. But using customer data to improve the product with use, if you're not doing that, you are missing a huge opportunity.
I love that. So second to last question that we ask everybody on the podcast, and this is a slight differential from what we've kind of been talking about so far, but I think it's important, and I always get feedback from my audience that they love hearing people's answers to this question. If you could go back in time and you could talk to 18-year-old Nir, but you only had enough time to tell him one thing, right, about life, about business, about happiness, fulfillment, what would you tell him?
This is a good question. I'd probably tell him to not take things so seriously. That, look, we're a tiny blue marble in a huge black vacuum floating around in space. Nobody's going to remember our names in 100 years. Right? Like, nobody's going to remember Einstein in 1,000 years. So enjoy your life, right? Like, don't take things quite so seriously. I think I have that tendency to maybe take things more seriously than I need to. And I think that's liberating. I'm not saying, I'm not a nihilist. I think, life, like, it is worth pursuing. Obviously, that's why I write my books is I do want to make something significant and leave a contribution, but maybe to take things a little less seriously.
I love that. And that's actually an answer similar to the one I think that I would give, because I've kind of thought about it after I've asked so many successful people the same question. So Nir, if people want to learn more about you, if people want to find your books, if people want to reach out to you, if that's something that you enjoy, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. So my blog is nirandfar.com. It's spelled like my first name, Nir, andfar.com. So nirandfar.com. And my first book is called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, which is what we talked about today. My second book, which we'll have to talk about another time, is called Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. And it's all about how to break bad habits like the habit of distraction.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on, brother. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kevin. It was fun.